Hi, this is Gary. In this poker tutorial, I'm going to cover the concept of relative versus absolute value. And when I value, I mean hand value. To start off, I'm going to start out with absolute hand strength here. Now, pre-flop, we have a pair of kings. On an absolute basis, against one opponent, there's only 6 combinations of aces out of 1,225 that they can be dealt that beat us. So in this situation, our hand has a very large absolute hand strength, and generally will also have a pretty high relative hand strength as well. If you look at the probability of one opponent getting dealt a pair of aces, it's 1 in 200. Two opponents playing against two opponents, the odds of one of them getting aces are 1 in 100. And as you can see, as the list goes on and on, we get down to as many as 9 different opponents. There's only a 1 in 23 chance that if we're dealt a pair of kings, our opponent will be dealt a pair of aces. So on a absolute basis, our hand is pretty strong, and on a relative basis as it is as well. Now let's shift gears a little bit and look at how the hand does post-flop. Well, in this situation, we have a pair of kings, and the board is king 8-3. So we have a set of kings, or 3 kings, and we have the best possible hand. Moving on to the turn, 7 of diamonds. We still have the best possible hand. The only way we can lose is to either quads, or a possible diamond draw, or a possible straight draw. So most of the time we're going to win in this situation. When we get to the river, it's 3 of spades. Well, we have a very, very strong absolute value hand. We're only losing to one combination on the river, and that is a pair of 3s. So absolute, we're pretty strong, and also relative, we're also pretty strong relative to an opponent's strong holdings on the river, with the exception of a pair of 3s. Now let's take a look at relative hand strength, and this is a little bit trickier. On the right, I have a possible listing of hands that an opponent can be dealt. Now, why it's so tricky is we're trying to figure out what exactly our opponent holds, and not every opponent is the same. There's all kinds of different playing styles, different philosophies, different ways people value their hands, and that's what makes this part the tricky part. I'm going to give an example here, and we're going to assume that we're playing against a rock. And we have the same pair of kings, but the rock only raises with ace-queen suited, ace-king, and a pair of 7s or better. I've circled that range there. Of all of those hands, we're only losing to aces. If we switch to a combo view, or combinations held, we beat approximately 48 combos, which I've highlighted there. So we beat a large percentage of the hands that the rock could be raising with. We only lose 6 combinations, and those are obviously pocket aces, and our opponent could actually have the same hand as us, well, not the same suit, but the same holding, and then there's one combination of kings, king of hearts, king of clubs. So on a relative basis, we're looking pretty strong against a tight player. Moving on to post-flop, let's say, for example, we get a flop of queen 8 deuce. It's a rainbow flop. And we know, or through our observations, we have determined that the rock only bets on the flop with top pair or better. Well, in this situation, the rock actually does bet on the flop. Well, if we want to figure out what our relative hand strength is, we look at the combinations that they might bet with. We essentially are beating 3 combinations of ace-queen suited that the rock would bet with, and we are losing to 12 combinations. 6 of those combinations are pocket aces, 3 of those combinations are pocket queens, and 3 of those combinations are pocket eights. So we're losing to 12 combinations, and of course we are still tied with a 1 combination of pocket kings at the rock we hold. So in this situation, while we have a pretty strong absolute hand, our relative hand strength has dropped dramatically due to the opponent's betting tendencies. Now, if this opponent were a loose, aggressive player, we would be ahead a significant margin there. And the reason we are behind is because the rock's preflop range is fairly tight, and when you couple that with the fact that the rock only bets top pair or better, we're essentially only beating 3 combinations of ace queen. Moving on to another example of relative hand strength, and this one I've taken out of my book Poker Hand Ranges Explained, which is available on Lulu Books. In this example, we raise with ace king, and we're playing against a fairly loose passive player I would classify as a calling station. They play 49.3% of their hands, about half the hands that we're going to assume in this example. They only call post flop with a pair, a gut shot, or 2 overcards. We get a flop of 999, and we want to know how often or how our hand is doing against our opponent's range post flop. Well, we look at the assumptions here. The opponent's passive. They call half the time. They don't raise at all. And they only call after the flop. Or that's the assumptions that we're going to use for this example here. So our hand looks something like that. And our opponent's range looks something like this. They're playing all the hands in blue there, and that comes out to about 49.3% of hands. One caveat in this example is that the raises are 0%, and I've circled some hands that some loose players might raise with. Well, this example, if the station did raise with the 4% of hands, we could remove that from the range, and our hand would actually be even stronger. But for the example we're doing, we're going to assume that they just call with everything. They don't raise at all. They don't bet. So back to the board here, we have 999. Now, what we need to do combination-wise is to get an idea of where they're at, we would adjust the calling station's holdings for the flop and our hand of ace king. So we remove some aces and some kings from their possible holdings, as well as a bunch of nines, because there's 3 nines in the flop. So we'd remove those combinations from the range I have there. Now their holdings look something like this, and I'm going to increase the size of that so you can read it here. The yellow stuff is the stuff we're ahead of. The brown stuff is the stuff we're drawing dead against, and the red stuff is the stuff we're losing to. The green stuff is the stuff we think we can get them to fold. So we get them fold about half the time if we bet on the flop in that situation based on their holdings and based on our estimation of that calling station's tendencies. So moving back here, to reiterate, we're ahead of 120 combos. We are losing to 111 combos, and we are tied with 9 combos. And the reason we might want to consider betting in this situation is they're going to fold 253 combos, and that means essentially that if we don't bet in that situation, approximately half the time we are giving a free card where they have, like, say 25% equity, and they can actually improve their hand and win the pot in that situation. So that would be one reason to bet. Now, when they call, it's about half the time we're ahead, slightly more than half, a little more than half the time we're behind. And essentially, that would be another example of relative hand strength. To summarize so far, relative hand strength is very tricky. It requires a lot of assumptions, and you have to have good reads on what your opponent's tendencies are and what they're likely to do in certain situations. So the saying goes, garbage in, garbage out, and that's very true with this. If you have bad assumptions or wrong assumptions, your model's no good. So you can walk through the concept and understand the concept, but if you make the wrong assumptions, then you're going to be doing the wrong things in certain situations. So you kind of have to adapt it to how your opponent plays. However, when it's done correctly, it can add a lot of value in tricky situations where you can situations that normally people would play passive. If you have a very good read and you're right on that read, you can extract a lot of value that you couldn't get in certain situations, and that can significantly add to the amount of money you're winning, or it can better yet, prevent you from losing money or losing big pots where you know something or have a strong inclination of a certain situation that saves you from getting into trouble. And that concludes our tutorial on poker concepts, relative versus absolute value. Thank you for watching.